The crack of skin against skin echoed across the mess hall, followed by the distinct clatter of Lieutenant Kenna Royce's meal tray hitting the floor. 37 pairs of eyes turned toward the sound, conversations stopping mid-sentence as beans and mashed potatoes scattered across polished linoleum. Major Blake Hutchins stood over her, his chest heaving with rage, his right hand still clenched from the backhand that had sent her stumbling. She didn't touch her face, didn't cry out, just straightened her shoulders and met his glare with steady brown eyes that seemed to absorb his fury without reflecting it back. "Did you see that?" someone whispered for the corner table. "He actually hit her." A fork clinked against a plate somewhere in the sudden quiet, the sound abnormally loud in the stillness that had fallen over the room. Major Hutchins stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and see the vein pulsing in his forehead. "Next time you think about filing complaints against my training methods, remember this moment, Lieutenant. Remember what happens to troublemakers on my base." Kenna remained silent, her hands clasped behind her back in perfect military posture. A thin line of blood traced from the corner of her mouth down her chin, but she made no move to wipe it away. The metallic taste spread across her tongue as she watched him, her expression unreadable. Sergeant Torres half rose from his seat at a nearby table, his face twisted with concern and indecision. "Major, sir, maybe we should." The words died in his throat when Hutchins whirled toward him, eyes blazing. "Something to say, Sergeant." The question came out as a growl, daring Torres to interfere. The sergeant sank back into his chair, his jaw clenched with frustration and shame. "I thought not," Hutchins said, turning back to Kenna. "This is what happens when people forget their place, when they think they can challenge the natural order around here." He gestured broadly at the mess hall, his voice rising. "Everyone here understands the hierarchy. Everyone except you, apparently." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the distant sound of kitchen staff who had frozen in place behind the serving line. Kenna's breathing remained steady, controlled, as if she were standing at attention during a routine inspection rather than bleeding from an unprovoked assault. Before we continue this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've witnessed similar acts of injustice where you're from. Captain Morris pushed through the kitchen doors, stopping abruptly when he took in the scene. His eyes moved from Hutchins to Kenna to the scattered food on the floor, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. "Major, what's the situation here?" "Training exercise, Captain," Hutchins replied without taking his eyes off Kenna. Lieutenant Royce was just learning about consequences. The weight of his words hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implied threat. "Is that blood, sir?" Captain Morris asked, stepping closer despite the tension radiating from Hutchins like heat from a furnace. "Minor training accident," the major said dismissively. "Nothing that requires medical attention." "Right, Lieutenant." The last word carried the force of a direct order, demanding her agreement with his version of events. Kenna finally spoke, her voice clear and steady despite the blood on her lip. "I understand perfectly, Major." The words were neutral, professional, giving nothing away. But something in her tone made Captain Morris shift uncomfortably, as if he'd heard a frequency only dogs could detect. "Outstanding," Hutchins said, his smile cold and satisfied. "Glad we could clear that up." He turned toward the exit, then paused and looked back at the room full of silent witnesses. "I trust everyone here understands that what they witnessed was a training exercise. Any confusion about that fact would be unfortunate for all involved." The threat rippled through the mess hall like a stone thrown into still water. Heads nodded reluctantly, eyes dropping to plates and tables. Only Kenna remained looking forward, her gaze fixed on something beyond the walls, beyond the base, as if she could see things others couldn't. After Hutchins left, the normal sounds of the mess hall gradually resumed, but the conversations were muted, uncomfortable. People glanced at Kenna from the corners of their eyes, some with sympathy, others with the careful distance of those who didn't want to be associated with trouble. She knelt and began collecting the scattered remains of her meal, her movements precise and unhurried. Sergeant Torres approached hesitantly, offering a handful of napkins. "Lieutenant, I'm sorry I didn't." He started to speak, then stopped, the words inadequate. "You followed orders, Sergeant," she replied quietly, accepting the napkins. "That's what soldiers do." But as she wiped the blood from her face, her fingers moved to something at her collar, adjusting what looked like an ordinary uniform pin. The gesture was subtle, barely noticeable, but Captain Morris caught it and frowned. Something about the way she touched that pin, the deliberate nature of the movement, sent an unexpected chill down his spine. He'd been in the military long enough to recognize the difference between routine uniform adjustment and purposeful action. This had been purposeful. Kenna stood, gathering the soiled napkins, and walked toward the exit with the same composed bearing she'd maintained throughout the entire encounter. As she passed Captain Morris, she paused for just a moment. "Thank you for your concern, Captain," she said quietly. "I'm sure this incident will be properly documented through appropriate channels." The words were simple, professional, but something in her delivery made them sound less like a statement and more like a promise. Then she was gone, leaving behind a mess hall full of uncomfortable silence and a growing sense that everyone present had just witnessed something far more significant than a simple disciplinary action. Captain Morris stared at the empty doorway, his unease deepening as he tried to shake the feeling that Major Hutchins had just made the biggest mistake of his military career. Captain Morris stood in the empty mess hall for several minutes after everyone had dispersed, staring at the spot where Lieutenant Royce had knelt to clean up her scattered meal. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their sterile glow across tables still bearing the evidence of interrupted conversations and abandoned trays. Something wasn't right. In 15 years of military service, he'd witnessed his share of disciplinary actions, training exercises, and legitimate accidents. What he'd just seen was none of those things. The deliberate nature of Hutchins' strike, the calculated cruelty in his words, the way every witness had immediately understood they were seeing an assault disguised as authority. More troubling was Lieutenant Royce's reaction. Most soldiers receiving such treatment would show anger, fear, or at minimum the shock of unexpected violence. She displayed none of those responses. Instead, she demonstrated a level of composure that spoke to either exceptional training or extensive experience with dangerous situations. Captain Morris made his way toward the administrative offices, his boots echoing in the corridor. The afternoon shift was changing, and he passed groups of personnel heading to various duties. Their conversations seemed forced, unnatural, as if word of the mess hall incident had already begun spreading through the base's invisible communication network. At the duty desk, Corporal Williams looked up from his paperwork. "Evening, Captain. Anything I can help you with?" "I need to see Lieutenant Royce's personnel file," Morris said, keeping his voice neutral. "Routine verification for duty assignments." Williams pulled up the computer records, his fingers clicking across the keyboard. "Here we go, sir. Lieutenant Kenna Royce. Assigned to logistics coordination 3 months ago. Clean record, standard qualifications." He paused, squinting at the screen. "That's odd." "What's odd, Corporal?" "Well, sir, her previous assignment location is listed as classified. And her training records." Williams scrolled down, frowning. "Most of her specialized training courses are redacted. I've never seen a logistics officer with this many classification markers." Captain Morris leaned closer to the screen, his unease deepening. The file showed standard information: height, weight, basic qualifications. But where most personnel files contain detailed training histories, deployment records, and performance evaluations, Lieutenant Royce's showed block after block of redacted information marked with security classifications he didn't recognize. "Print me a copy of what's available," he instructed Williams. "And Corporal, this inquiry stays between us." "Understood, sir." Morris took the sparse printout and walked to his office, closing the door behind him. The file raised more questions than it answered. Why would a logistics officer require such extensive classification protections? What kind of training generated that many redacted entries? And most importantly, Why was someone with this level of security clearance assigned to routine supply coordination on a training base? His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Morris here. Captain, this is base security. We have a situation developing. Lieutenant Royce submitted an incident report through the emergency notification system about 30 minutes ago. The report has been automatically forwarded to several commands outside our normal chain. Which commands? Morris asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer would be unsatisfying. Sir, the forwarding destinations are classified above my clearance level, but I can tell you that the system flagged this as a priority escalation. We're seeing automated responses from locations I don't have authorization to identify. Captain Morris felt his stomach drop. Emergency notification systems with automatic escalation protocols were reserved for incidents involving personnel with special protections. Intelligence operatives, undercover investigators, individuals whose safety carried implications far beyond normal military disciplinary procedures. Have you notified Major Hutchins about the report? Negative, sir. The system protocols specifically prohibit local notification when certain classification triggers are activated. This is being handled entirely outside our command structure. Understood. Keep me informed of any developments. Morris hung up and stared at the redacted personnel file spread across his desk. Major Hutchins had no idea what he'd done. The man probably assumed his authority and intimidation tactics would keep the incident buried, just as they had countless times before. But if Lieutenant Royce carried the kind of classification protections suggested by our file, then Hutchins had just assaulted someone whose safety was monitored by agencies with the power to shut down entire installations. Across the base, Major Hutchins was settling into his evening routine, completely unaware that his name had just appeared on computer screens in offices he'd never heard of, being reviewed by personnel who could end his career with a single phone call. He poured himself a bourbon and reviewed the next day's training schedule, satisfied that his demonstration of authority would prevent future challenges to his methods. The base continued its normal operations as the afternoon faded into evening. Personnel reported for duty shifts, conducted routine maintenance, prepared for the next day's activities. But beneath the surface of military routine, electronic communications were moving through encrypted channels, reaching destinations that existed in the shadowy intersection of military command and national security. In Washington, a secure phone rang in an office 3 floors below street level. The duty officer who answered it listened to an automated briefing about an incident involving a protected asset at a remote training facility. Within minutes, that information was forwarded to a conference room where 3 individuals with stars on their uniforms were reviewing evening intelligence summaries. The youngest of the 3 generals looked up from his tablet. We have a priority alpha notification from Installation 847. Asset designation Falcon 7 reports assault by local command authority. The words were delivered in the flat, professional tone reserved for information that would soon become someone else's very serious problem. Falcon 7, the senior general repeated, consulting his own device. That's our embedded inspector, the one investigating the harassment complaints. He set down his tablet and reached for the secure phone. Give me transportation to Installation 847. Full command detail. We leave within the hour. Sir, the 3rd general said, reviewing additional information on his screen. The perpetrator is Major Blake Hutchins, base training officer. This will be his 3rd formal complaint in 18 months. Previous incidents were handled through local command. Not anymore, the senior general replied grimly. When someone assaults a federal inspector conducting an official investigation, it becomes our problem. And our problem becomes Major Hutchins' career-ending mistake. Back at Installation 847, Lieutenant Royce sat in her quarters, carefully documenting every detail of the assault in her official report. Her laptop screen showed multiple communication windows, encrypted channels connecting her to handlers who existed in bureaucratic spaces most military personnel never glimpsed. The bruise on her face was darkening, a purple shadow that would serve as physical evidence of Major Hutchins' criminal behavior. She photographed it from multiple angles, each image automatically transmitted to investigators who were already preparing to descend on the base like a bureaucratic hurricane. Her mission had been simple: investigate reports of systematic harassment and abuse within the training programs, gather evidence, document patterns, identify command failures. What she hadn't expected was for the primary suspect to assault her directly, providing the kind of undeniable evidence that would trigger immediate federal intervention. Lieutenant Royce closed her laptop and prepared for sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring changes to Installation 847 that Major Hutchins could never imagine. 3 generals were already in flight, carrying with them the authority to shut down the entire base if necessary. The incident that Hutchins dismissed as a training exercise would soon reveal itself as the mistake that ended his career and exposed the systematic failures that had allowed his behavior to continue unchecked for years. The next morning brought a deceptive calm to Installation 847. Major Hutchins arrived at his office before dawn, energized by what he considered a successful demonstration of authority. He'd dealt with troublemakers before, and Lieutenant Royce would fall in line just like the others. The key was making examples early and often, showing everyone that challenges to his methods would be met with immediate consequences. He poured coffee from the pot his aide had prepared and reviewed the morning briefing reports, training schedules, equipment maintenance, personnel evaluations. Everything proceeding according to his carefully maintained system of control and intimidation. Nothing in the paperwork suggested that his world was about to collapse around him. Sergeant First Class Martinez knocked on his door at precisely 0700. "Come in," Hutchins called, not looking up from his desk. "Sir," Martinez said, stepping into the office with obvious reluctance. "I wanted to discuss yesterday's incident in the mess hall. Several personnel have expressed concerns about the training exercise with Lieutenant Royce." Hutchins finally looked up, his expression hardening. "Concerns, Sergeant? What kind of concerns?" "Well, sir, some of the junior enlisted are confused about the nature of the exercise. They're asking questions about proper procedures for physical training demonstrations." Martinez shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation, but unwilling to abandon it entirely. The major leaned back in his chair, studying Martinez with the predatory focus of someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of intimidation. "Are you questioning my training methods, Sergeant?" "No, sir, not directly. But the incident looked more like." Martinez paused, searching for words that wouldn't trigger immediate retaliation. It appeared to exceed normal training parameters. Hutchins stood slowly, deliberately, allowing his full height and presence to dominate the small office space. "Sergeant Martinez, you've been under my command for 2 years. In that time, have my methods produced results?" "Yes, sir, they have." "Have disciplinary problems decreased since I implemented my leadership philosophy?" "Yes, sir." "Have training scores improved across all metrics?" "They have, sir." "Then I suggest you focus on those results rather than questioning techniques you don't fully understand." Hutchins moved closer, forcing Martinez to crane his neck to maintain eye contact. Lieutenant Royce needed correction. She received correction. End of discussion. "But sir, the blood, the visible injury." Several witnesses described it as an assault rather than training. The word assault hung in the air between them like an accusation. Hutchins' jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "You need to be very careful about the words you choose, Sergeant. Very careful about the implications you're making." "I'm not implying anything, sir. I'm reporting the concerns of personnel under my supervision. They're asking questions I don't know how to answer." Then tell them that Major Blake Hutchins has been conducting military training for 12 years without a single official reprimand. Tell them that my methods are approved by base command and have consistently produced superior results. Tell them that soldiers who can't handle realistic training conditions have no business wearing the uniform. Martinez remained standing at attention, but his expression showed the internal struggle between military obedience and moral concern. "Roger that, sir. Will there be additional training exercises of this nature?" "As needed," Hutchins replied curtly. "Dismissed." After Martinez left, Hutchins walked to his window, overlooking the training grounds. Groups of soldiers were beginning their morning exercises, their movements synchronized and precise. His program worked. His methods produced results. A few uncomfortable questions from squeamish subordinates wouldn't change that fundamental reality. What he didn't know was that Martinez had already spoken with Captain Morris before their meeting. The sergeant's questions weren't casual concerns from confused personnel. They were carefully crafted probes designed to document Hutchins' attitude and responses for investigators who were already reviewing every aspect of his command. 300 miles away, General Harrison's transport plane was crossing into the Installation 847 operational area. The aircraft carried not just 3 general officers, but a complete investigative team including military police, intelligence specialists, and federal prosecutors. The response to Lieutenant Royce's assault had triggered protocols reserved for attacks on federal agents and protected personnel. Colonel Sarah Vance, the senior investigator, reviewed case files during the flight. "This isn't Hutchins' first incident," she told General Harrison. "We have documented complaints dating back 3 years. Sexual harassment, physical intimidation, abuse of authority. Local command consistently buried the reports or transferred the complainants." "Why wasn't federal intervention triggered earlier?" the general asked. "Previous victims were standard military personnel without special protection classifications. Their complaints went through normal channels, where Hutchins had sufficient influence to control outcomes. But Lieutenant Royce carries federal inspector credentials. Assaulting her is equivalent to assaulting a federal agent conducting an official investigation." General Harrison studied photographs of the incident taken by security cameras that Hutchins didn't know existed. The images showed the assault in brutal clarity, leaving no room for interpretation or denial. What's the base commander's involvement? Colonel Patricia Webb has been in command for 8 months. Our preliminary investigation suggests she inherited Hutchins' behavior pattern rather than creating it. She may have been deliberately kept uninformed about the true nature of his methods. That would make her negligent rather than complicit, Harrison noted. Still grounds for removal, but not criminal charges. The plane began its descent toward Installation 847. General Harrison looked out the window at the sprawling military complex below, knowing that within hours, every person on that base would understand that systematic abuse had consequences reaching far beyond local command authority. Back on the ground, Lieutenant Royce was beginning her normal duty shift in a logistics center, her bruised face drawing stares and whispered conversations from personnel who still believed she was simply an unlucky target of training gone wrong. She processed supply requests and coordinated equipment deliveries with the same professional competence she'd shown since arriving at the base 3 months earlier. But her real work was documenting everything. Every conversation that revealed knowledge of Hutchins' pattern of abuse. Every admission that previous complaints had been ignored or suppressed. Every indication that the command structure had enabled systematic harassment through willful blindness or active participation. Her laptop contained encrypted files detailing dozens of incidents involving multiple victims. Hutchins had created a culture of fear that allowed him to abuse his authority without consequences, protected by a command structure more concerned with avoiding embarrassment than addressing criminal behavior. That protection was about to evaporate completely. At 10:30 that morning, the base communications center received an encrypted message that automatically forwarded to Commander Webb's personal terminal. Priority Alpha notification. Federal investigation team inbound. Estimated arrival 11:45 hours. Prepare for immediate command suspension and facility lockdown. Commander Webb stared at the message, reading it 3 times before its implications fully registered. Federal investigation teams weren't deployed for routine disciplinary issues or training accidents. They were reserved for crimes involving national security, systematic corruption, or attacks on federal personnel. She reached for her phone to call Major Hutchins, then stopped. If a federal team was inbound, then communicating with potential subjects could constitute obstruction of justice. Instead, she called her legal advisor and began preparing for what appeared to be the end of her command. Major Hutchins stood before his assembled training staff at 1100 hours, completely unaware that federal investigators were less than an hour from landing on his base. The morning briefing proceeded with his usual blend of military precision and barely contained aggression, his voice carrying the authority of someone who believed himself untouchable. Yesterday's training exercise with Lieutenant Royce has generated some discussion among personnel. He began, his tone suggesting that such discussion was both unwelcome and potentially dangerous. I want to make something perfectly clear to all of you. My training methods are designed to prepare soldiers for real combat conditions. Real combat doesn't come with safety briefings and trigger warnings. Staff Sergeant Coleman shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sir, some of the enlisted personnel are asking specific questions about physical contact protocols during training exercises. They want clarification on proper procedures. Hutchins turned his predatory gaze on Coleman, his jaw tightening. Staff Sergeant, are you suggesting that I don't understand proper training procedures? After 12 years of conducting military instruction. No, sir, Coleman replied quickly. I'm just reporting the questions I'm receiving from subordinates. Then perhaps you should focus on answering those questions with confidence in your command structure rather than bringing them to me like some kind of complaint. Hutchins stepped closer to Coleman's chair, using his physical presence to dominate the conversation. When soldiers question training methods, it indicates a failure of leadership at the non-commissioned officer level. The implicit threat hung in the air like smoke. Coleman nodded stiffly, understanding that pursuing the topic further would mark him as another problem requiring correction. Around the conference table, other staff members studied their notebooks with sudden intensity, avoiding eye contact that might draw Hutchins' attention. What they didn't know was that Captain Morris was recording the entire briefing from the observation room next door, using equipment that Lieutenant Royce had quietly activated the previous evening. Every word, every threat, every demonstration of the toxic leadership style that had poisoned the base for years was being documented for federal investigators. Lieutenant Walsh, Hutchins continued, moving on to his next target. I understand you've been discussing the mess hall incident with personnel in your section. Care to explain why? Walsh, a 24-year-old officer with less than 2 years of service, struggled to maintain composure under Hutchins' intimidating stare. Sir, my soldiers witnessed the training exercise and asked questions about appropriate responses when they observed such activities. And what did you tell them, Lieutenant? I told them to focus on their assigned duties and maintain proper military discipline, Walsh replied, his voice barely steady. Did you also tell them that questioning command decisions is insubordination? Did you explain that second-guessing training methods undermines unit cohesion and combat readiness? I emphasize the importance of supporting command authority, sir. Hutchins smiled coldly, satisfied with the young officer's obvious fear. Outstanding. That's exactly the kind of leadership I expect from my officers. Clear, unambiguous support for established authority. Outside the conference room, Lieutenant Royce walked past the door, carrying a clipboard of routine logistics reports. To any observer, she appeared to be conducting normal administrative duties. In reality, she was positioning recording equipment and ensuring that every aspect of Hutchins' intimidation campaign was being captured by multiple surveillance systems. Her bruised face had darkened overnight, the purple and yellow discoloration making her injury impossible to ignore. Personnel throughout the base had seen her that morning, their reactions ranging from sympathy to carefully concealed anger. Word was spreading despite Hutchins' attempts at intimidation, creating an undercurrent of tension that experienced soldiers recognized as the prelude to significant change. At 11:35, the air traffic control tower received notification of incoming priority aircraft requesting immediate landing clearance. The flight designation carried federal authority codes that automatically granted access regardless of base schedules or security protocols. Tower to base command, the controller announced over secured communications. Priority federal aircraft requesting emergency landing clearance. Estimated touchdown in 10 minutes. Commander Webb, who had spent the morning reviewing legal protocols and preparing for federal intervention, acknowledged the transmission with growing dread. She understood that the approaching aircraft represented the end of her command and quite possibly the end of her military career. The question was whether she would be classified as complicit in Hutchins' behavior or merely negligent in failing to prevent it. In the training building, Hutchins was concluding his staff meeting with his usual combination of threats and false confidence. Remember, he told the assembled officers and non-commissioned officers, "We maintain the highest training standards on this installation precisely because we don't compromise our methods for comfort or convenience. Real soldiers understand that tough training saves lives in combat." The meeting ended with the staff filing out in uncomfortable silence, each person carrying the weight of unspoken concerns and suppressed anger. None of them knew that their private conversations about Hutchins' behavior had been documented by federal investigators for months, or that Lieutenant Royce's assault had triggered the final phase of a comprehensive investigation into systematic abuse throughout the installation. Hutchins returned to his office, poured fresh coffee, and began reviewing afternoon training schedules. His calendar showed routine exercises, equipment inspections, and personnel evaluations. Nothing to suggest that his world was about to explode around him in approximately 6 minutes. The federal aircraft touched down at Installation 847 at exactly 11:41 hours. General Harrison emerged from the plane, followed by a team of investigators carrying briefcases, recording equipment, and arrest warrants. Their arrival triggered automatic security protocols that sealed the base from normal operations and initiated emergency command procedures. Commander Webb met the federal team at the flight line, her expression showing the resignation of someone who understood that everything was about to change. "General Harrison," she said formally, "Installation 847 is at your disposal." "Colonel Webb," Harrison replied grimly, "as of this moment, this installation is under federal investigation for systematic violations of military law, civil rights violations, and assault on federal personnel. You are relieved of command pending completion of our inquiry." The words carried across the flight line like thunder, reaching the ears of maintenance personnel and security guards who immediately understood that they were witnessing the beginning of a reckoning that would touch every aspect of base operations. In his office, Major Hutchins was completely unaware that federal agents were walking through the main gate, carrying with them the evidence and authority to destroy everything he had built through years of intimidation and abuse. He sipped his coffee and planned his afternoon training session, confident that Lieutenant Royce had learned her lesson and that his demonstration of authority would prevent future challenges. He had no idea that Lieutenant Royce was federal investigator with protection classifications that made assaulting her equivalent to attacking a federal agent. He didn't know that every conversation, every threat, every moment of his toxic leadership had been documented and transmitted to agencies with the power to end his career and his freedom. But he was about to learn all of that, starting in approximately 3 minutes, when federal agents would knock on his office door and begin reading him his rights. The calm before the storm was ending, and Major Blake Hutchins was about to discover that there were authorities in the military justice system that existed far beyond his ability to intimidate or control. The knock on Major Hutchins' office door came at 11:44 hours, sharp and authoritative in a way that cut through his afternoon planning like a blade. He looked up from his training schedules, irritated by the interruption to his carefully organized routine. "Enter," he called, expecting to see one of his subordinates with some minor administrative issue that required his attention. The door opened to reveal 3 individuals he didn't recognize. The lead figure was a woman in her 40s wearing the uniform of a military police colonel, her bearing radiating the kind of quiet authority that came from years of handling serious criminal investigations. Behind her stood 2 federal agents in civilian clothes, their expressions professionally neutral, but their presence unmistakably official. "Major Blake Hutchins," the colonel said, stepping into his office without invitation. "I'm Colonel Sarah Vance, Military Police Investigative Command. These are Special Agents Rodriguez and Chun from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. We need to speak with you about an incident that occurred yesterday in the installation mess hall." Hutchins felt his first flutter of unease though he maintained his outward composure. The presence of federal investigators suggested something far more serious than the routine disciplinary matter he'd assumed he was handling. What incident would that be, Colonel? The assault of Lieutenant Kenna Royce during the evening meal period, Agent Rodriguez replied, pulling out a digital recorder and placing it on Hutchins' desk. This conversation is being recorded for official purposes. You have the right to remain silent and to have legal counsel present during questioning. The words hit Hutchins like physical blows. Assault, rights, legal counsel, the terminology of criminal proceedings rather than military discipline. He stared at the recording device, his mind racing to process implications he'd never considered. I think there's been some misunderstanding, he said carefully. Lieutenant Royce participated in a training exercise designed to test her response to physical stress. All activities were conducted within established military training parameters. Colonel Vance consulted her tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be extensive documentation. Major, we have video evidence of you striking Lieutenant Royce with sufficient force to draw blood. We have testimony from 37 witnesses describing the incident as an unprovoked assault. We have medical documentation of her injuries. None of this evidence supports your characterization of a training exercise. Hutchins felt his carefully constructed world beginning to shift beneath him. Video evidence. Medical documentation. The clinical precision of a federal investigation that had been building long before yesterday's incident. How was that possible when he'd assumed his authority would keep everything contained to the local level? I've been conducting military training for 12 years without complaint, he said, falling back on his standard defense. My methods are approved by base command and have consistently produced superior results. Agent Chen opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. Actually, Major, we have documented complaints dating back 42 months. Sexual harassment allegations from Staff Sergeant Williams. Physical intimidation reports from multiple junior officers. Abuse of authority complaints from enlisted personnel across 6 different sections. The folder landed on Hutchins' desk with a sound like thunder. Each page represented a victim he'd silenced through intimidation, a complaint he'd thought buried through his influence with local command. The federal investigators had been building a case against him for years, waiting for the right trigger to bring it all crashing down. Those complaints were investigated and dismissed. Hutchins protested, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. Standard military justice procedures were followed in every case. Colonel Vance smiled coldly. They were buried by a command structure that prioritized institutional reputation over victim protection. But Lieutenant Royce carries federal inspector credentials. Assaulting her triggered automatic protocols that bypass local command authority entirely. Federal inspector. The words hit Hutchins like an avalanche, explaining everything he hadn't understood about the previous 24 hours. Lieutenant Royce wasn't just another soldier he could intimidate into silence. She was a federal agent conducting an official investigation, protected by laws that made attacking her equivalent to assaulting an FBI agent or federal prosecutor. I want legal counsel, he said quietly, finally understanding that his career and his freedom were in immediate jeopardy. That's your right, Agent Rodriguez replied. But first, you need to understand the scope of this investigation. We're not just examining yesterday's assault. We're reviewing every aspect of your command over the past 4 years. Every complaint, every intimidation tactic, every abuse of authority that created the culture that made yesterday's incident possible. Colonel Vance stood and walked to Hutchins' window, looking out at the training grounds where soldiers continued their routines in ignorance of the federal storm consuming their command structure. Major Hutchins, you've spent years believing that your rank and local influence made you untouchable. You've silenced victims, buried complaints, and created a climate of fear that allowed systematic abuse to flourish unchecked. She turned back to face him, her expression showing no mercy for his obvious distress. But federal law doesn't recognize local military politics. When you assault a federal inspector, you trigger investigations that reach levels of authority you've never imagined. Yesterday, you didn't just hit Lieutenant Royce. You attacked the federal government itself. Hutchins slumped in his chair, the full magnitude of his situation finally becoming clear. Every threat he'd made, every victim he'd silenced, every complaint he'd buried was about to be examined by investigators with the power to destroy him completely. Outside his office, word was spreading through the base that federal agents had arrived and were conducting arrests. Personnel gathered in small groups, whispering about the implications and wondering which of their commanders would be led away in handcuffs. The culture of fear that Hutchins had created was transforming into something else entirely: the anticipation of justice. Lieutenant Royce continued her routine duties in the logistics center, her bruised face serving as visible evidence of the crime that had triggered this federal intervention. Soldiers who passed her desk now understood that she wasn't just another victim of Hutchins' abuse. She was the agent who had finally brought down a system of systematic intimidation that had poisoned their installation for years. Agent Chun was reading Hutchins his formal rights when Captain Morris appeared in the doorway, his expression grim but satisfied. The captain had spent months documenting Hutchins' behavior, waiting for an opportunity to see justice served. Yesterday's assault had provided that opportunity, and he'd ensured that every piece of evidence was properly preserved for federal prosecutors. Major Blake Hutchins, Colonel Vance announced formally, "You're under arrest for assault on a federal officer, obstruction of justice, violation of civil rights under color of authority, and conspiracy to suppress official investigations. You will be transported to federal detention pending formal charges." The handcuffs clicked shut around Hutchins' wrists with a sound that echoed through his office like the closing of a tomb. His 12-year military career was ending not with honor or recognition, but with criminal charges that would follow him for the rest of his life. As federal agents escorted him from his office, Hutchins passed soldiers who had suffered under his command for years. Their faces showed a mixture of satisfaction, relief, and amazement that someone they considered untouchable was finally facing consequences for his actions. The man who had ruled through fear and intimidation was learning that there were authorities in the federal system that existed far beyond his ability to threaten or control. The perp walk from Hutchins' office to the waiting federal transport vehicle took exactly 93 seconds, but those seconds transformed installation 847 forever. Word spread through the base like wildfire as soldiers watched their feared training commander being escorted in handcuffs by federal agents, his face pale with shock and the sudden understanding that his world had collapsed completely. Sergeant Torres stood with a group of enlisted personnel near the motor pool, watching the procession with a mixture of disbelief and vindication. "Holy shit," he whispered to Corporal Henderson. "They actually arrested him. The bastard finally got what was coming to him." Henderson nodded grimly, remembering his own encounters with Hutchins' intimidation tactics. Took long enough. How many people did he terrorize before someone finally stood up to him? The question hung in the air as they watched federal agents load Hutchins into an unmarked sedan. Around the base, similar conversations were erupting as personnel processed the implications of what they were witnessing. The man who had seemed untouchable, who had silenced complaints and buried investigations through sheer force of intimidation, was being taken away like any common criminal. In the communications center, Staff Sergeant Kim was fielding calls from multiple commands wanting information about the federal operation. The phone lines were overwhelmed with queries from regional headquarters, Pentagon liaisons, and congressional offices that had apparently been monitoring the situation. The scope of interest suggested that Hutchins' behavior had attracted attention far beyond what anyone on the base had imagined. "Ma'am," Kim said to Colonel Vance as she entered the communications center, "we're receiving priority calls from the Secretary of Defense's office, Senate Armed Services Committee staff, and at least 6 different Inspector General offices. They all want immediate briefings on the situation." Colonel Vance took the list of callers, scanning the names with professional efficiency. The assault on Lieutenant Royce had triggered automatic notifications throughout the federal system, alerting agencies and officials who monitored violations against protected personnel. What had seemed like a local disciplinary issue to Hutchins was actually a federal crime with implications reaching the highest levels of government. Route all calls through my secure line, she instructed Kim. Nobody on this base provides information to outside agencies without my explicit authorization. This investigation is now classified at the highest levels. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Royce was being escorted to a secure briefing room where she would provide her detailed statement to federal investigators. Her role as an embedded inspector was no longer secret, and personnel throughout the base were beginning to understand that her 3-month assignment had been part of a sophisticated federal investigation into systematic abuse and cover-ups. Captain Morris met her in the corridor outside the briefing room, his expression showing both admiration and concern. "Lieutenant, I owe you an apology. I should have acted sooner when I suspected what Hutchins was doing." "You acted when it mattered, Captain," she replied quietly. "Your documentation and witness statements provided crucial evidence for the federal case. Without your cooperation, Hutchins might have succeeded in burying this incident like all the others." Morris nodded, but the weight of his inaction during months of suspected abuse continued to burden his conscience. How many victims could have been spared if he'd found the courage to challenge Hutchins earlier? The question would haunt him long after the investigation concluded. In the base commander's office, the temporary command structure was struggling to maintain normal operations while federal agents interviewed personnel and seized records. Colonel Webb had been relieved of duty pending investigation of her role in enabling Hutchins' behavior, leaving Captain Morris as the senior officer attempting to coordinate with federal authorities. The afternoon training schedule had been suspended indefinitely. Soldiers who normally would be conducting exercises were instead being interviewed by investigators documenting years of systematic abuse. Each conversation revealed additional victims, additional incidents, additional evidence of a command structure that had prioritized institutional reputation over soldier welfare. Special Agent Rodriguez was reviewing personnel files when he made a discovery that explained the scope of federal interest in the case. Lieutenant Royce's assignment to Installation 847 hadn't been random or routine. She'd been sent specifically to investigate Hutchins after 3 separate congressional inquiries about harassment complaints that had been mysteriously dismissed or buried. The federal investigation represented the culmination of years of political pressure from lawmakers who had received constituent complaints about military justice failures. Hutchins' assault on Lieutenant Royce had provided the criminal evidence needed to justify comprehensive federal intervention in a system that had protected abusers through institutional indifference. Agent Chun was interviewing Sergeant First Class Martinez when the full pattern of Hutchins' behavior became clear. Martinez described a climate of fear that extended far beyond physical intimidation, including sexual harassment, financial coercion, and systematic retaliation against anyone who reported misconduct. He made it clear that complaining about his methods was career suicide, Martinez explained. Soldiers who filed reports found themselves transferred to undesirable assignments, passed over for promotions, or subjected to enhanced scrutiny that made their lives miserable. Eventually, people stopped reporting incidents because they knew nothing would happen except their own punishment. The interview revealed the sophisticated nature of Hutchins' abuse system. He hadn't just intimidated individual victims. He'd created an institutional culture that punished whistleblowing and rewarded silence. His assault on Lieutenant Royce represented the culmination of years of escalating abuse enabled by command indifference. As the afternoon progressed, federal agents arrested 2 additional officers who had actively participated in covering up Hutchins' misconduct. Staff Sergeant Coleman was taken into custody for intimidating witnesses, while Lieutenant Walsh faced charges for falsifying incident reports. The investigation was expanding beyond Hutchins himself to encompass everyone who had enabled his systematic abuse. By 1700 hours, Installation 847 was effectively under federal control. Normal operations had ceased while investigators combed through years of records, interviewed dozens of witnesses, and documented evidence of what federal prosecutors were calling one of the most extensive command failures in recent military history. Lieutenant Royce finished her formal statement and prepared to leave the base under federal protection. Her mission was complete, but the evidence she'd gathered would fuel prosecutions and reforms that would take years to fully implement. The bruise on her face had become a symbol of federal determination to hold military commanders accountable for protecting rather than victimizing their subordinates. As federal agents prepared to transport additional suspects to detention facilities, word reached Installation 847 that congressional hearings were being scheduled to examine how Hutchins' behavior had been allowed to continue unchecked for years. The case was evolving from a criminal investigation into a systemic examination of military justice failures. The base that had operated under Hutchins' reign of terror was transforming into a symbol of federal commitment to protecting military personnel from abuse by their own commanders. 3 generals had arrived to shut down the base, not just physically, but symbolically, demonstrating that systematic misconduct would trigger consequences reaching the highest levels of government. Soldiers throughout Installation 847 were beginning to understand that Lieutenant Royce's courage in filing her federal report had triggered changes that would protect future generations of military personnel from commanders who believed their rank made them above the law. The shockwaves from Hutchins' arrest were spreading far beyond the base perimeter, reaching congressional offices, Pentagon briefing rooms, and newsrooms where reporters were beginning to investigate how a single training officer had been allowed to terrorize subordinates for years without meaningful intervention from military leadership. By nightfall, the scope of the federal investigation had expanded beyond anyone's imagination. What began as documentation of Hutchins' assault on Lieutenant Royce had evolved into a comprehensive examination of institutional failures spanning multiple commands and years of systematic cover-ups. The secure conference room that served as the Federal Command Center buzzed with activity as investigators processed evidence that painted a disturbing picture of military justice corruption. General Harrison reviewed the preliminary findings with growing anger. The pattern of abuse wasn't limited to Installation 847. Hutchins had served at 3 previous bases, leaving behind a trail of buried complaints and transferred victims that suggested a deliberate strategy of institutional protection for predatory commanders. Colonel Vance approached with a tablet full of disturbing revelations. "Sir, we've identified at least 47 victims across Hutchins' career. Sexual harassment, physical intimidation, financial coercion, and systematic retaliation against anyone who reported misconduct. Each time complaints surfaced, he was quietly transferred to a new assignment rather than facing investigation." Harrison's jaw clenched as he absorbed the implications. 47 victims. That means 47 failures by commanding officers who chose institutional reputation over soldier protection. How high does this conspiracy reach? We're still investigating, but preliminary evidence suggests knowledge and participation at the regional command level. General Morrison's staff has been handling Hutchins' transfers and ensuring that complaint files were sealed or destroyed. This appears to be a systematic pattern rather than isolated incidents. The revelation that general officers have participated in protecting Hutchins sent shockwaves through the federal team. What they'd assumed was local command failure was actually a sophisticated conspiracy involving multiple installations and senior leadership willing to sacrifice soldier welfare to avoid embarrassing investigations. Agent Rodriguez entered the conference room carrying evidence that would reshape the entire investigation. "General, we've recovered encrypted communications between Hutchins and his handlers at Regional Command. They've been coordinating his transfers and managing victim complaints for over 4 years. This is organized criminal activity under federal law." The encrypted messages revealed a level of coordination that transformed the case from individual misconduct into organized conspiracy. Senior officers have been actively managing Hutchins' career to minimize exposure while allowing his abusive behavior to continue unchecked. Each transfer represented another group of soldiers subjected to systematic victimization. Meanwhile, throughout Installation 847, personnel were beginning to understand the true scope of what they'd witnessed. The federal investigation wasn't just examining yesterday's assault. It was unraveling years of institutional corruption that had protected predators while silencing victims. Sergeant Torres gathered with other non-commissioned officers in the enlisted quarters, their conversations reflecting a mixture of vindication and anger. All those complaints that disappeared, he said grimly. All those soldiers who got transferred or discharged rather than getting justice. We knew something was wrong, but nobody wanted to believe it went this high. Staff Sergeant Williams nodded, remembering her own experience reporting Hutchins' sexual harassment 2 years earlier. They told me the complaint was unfounded and suggested I consider a transfer to avoid further difficulties. I thought it was just local politics, but now it looks like they were protecting him systematically. The conversations throughout the base reflected a growing understanding that Lieutenant Royce's courage had exposed not just individual misconduct, but institutional corruption that had sacrificed soldier welfare for administrative convenience. The federal investigation was revealing a system designed to protect predators rather than victims. In Washington, emergency briefings were being conducted for congressional leadership and Pentagon officials who were learning that one of their training installations had become a federal crime scene. The assault on Lieutenant Royce had triggered automatic notifications that reached the highest levels of government, forcing acknowledgement of systemic failures that had been deliberately concealed for years. Senator Patricia Hayes, chair of the Armed Services Committee, was reviewing classified briefings about the investigation when the true scope became clear. This isn't just about Major Hutchins, she told her staff. This is about a conspiracy involving general officers who were willing to enable systematic abuse rather than face the embarrassment of public accountability. The senator's office began preparing for congressional hearings that would examine how military leadership had failed so completely in their responsibility to protect subordinates from predatory commanders. The case was evolving into a defining moment for military justice reform. Back at Installation 847, Lieutenant Royce was providing additional testimony about the sophisticated nature of the cover-up system she discovered during her embedded investigation. Her detailed documentation revealed a pattern of evidence destruction, witness intimidation, and administrative manipulation that had enabled Hutchins' behavior for years. They weren't just ignoring complaints, she explained to federal investigators. They were actively suppressing them through a coordinated system involving multiple commands. Victims were transferred, records were sealed, and anyone who persisted in seeking justice faced career-ending retaliation. The testimony confirmed what federal investigators had suspected. The assault on Lieutenant Royce represented the culmination of a systematic conspiracy to enable predatory behavior while avoiding accountability. Her federal protection status had finally triggered consequences that local commanders couldn't suppress or control. Agent Chun was documenting the financial aspects of the conspiracy when he discovered evidence of additional crimes. General Morrison's staff had been manipulating personnel records, budget allocations, and transfer orders to manage the cover-up operation. What began as institutional negligence had evolved into organized criminal activity involving fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. The investigation was expanding beyond military justice into federal criminal law, with implications that would reach courtrooms, congressional hearing rooms, and Pentagon reform initiatives. Lieutenant Royce's assault had triggered a reckoning that would reshape military accountability for years to come. As midnight approached, federal agents were preparing arrest warrants for senior officers who had participated in the conspiracy. General Morrison would be taken into custody within hours, along with his chief of staff and the officers who had coordinated Hutchins' protection system. The base that had operated under a culture of fear and systematic abuse was transforming into a symbol of federal determination to hold military leadership accountable for their failures. 3 generals had arrived to shut down not just the installation, but the entire system that had enabled predatory behavior through institutional indifference. Lieutenant Royce's courage in filing her federal report had triggered consequences that were spreading far beyond Installation 847. Reaching command structures, congressional offices, and courtrooms where the full scope of military justice failures would be exposed and addressed. The investigation that began with documenting a single assault was revealing a conspiracy involving dozens of officers and hundreds of victims, demonstrating that systematic reform would be necessary to prevent future failures of leadership and accountability. Soldiers throughout the military were beginning to understand that the federal response to Hutchins' behavior represented a fundamental shift in how allegations of abuse would be investigated and prosecuted, with protections for whistleblowers and consequences for commanders who enabled predatory behavior. The reckoning triggered by Lieutenant Royce's assault was spreading through the military justice system like wildfire, burning away the institutional protections that had shielded abusers while victimizing the soldiers they were sworn to protect. At 0300 hours, federal agents simultaneously executed arrest warrants at 7 military installations across 3 states. The coordinated operation represented the largest military corruption investigation in decades, triggered by Lieutenant Royce's assault report that had exposed a network of senior officers who had spent years protecting predatory commanders. General Richard Morrison was awakened in his quarters at Regional Command Headquarters by FBI agents carrying federal arrest warrants. His wife watched in horror as her husband of 28 years was handcuffed and read his rights for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations under color of authority. General Morrison, Agent Patterson announced formally, "You're under arrest for your role in a conspiracy to suppress criminal investigations, intimidate witnesses, and enable systematic abuse of military personnel. You have the right to remain silent." Morrison's face showed the shock of someone who had believed his rank and connections made him untouchable. For 4 years, he had coordinated the protection of officers like Hutchins, viewing their misconduct as manageable public relations problems rather than serious crimes requiring prosecution. The encrypted communications recovered from his office revealed the sophisticated nature of the conspiracy. Morrison had personally approved Hutchins' transfers, ensured that complaint files were classified or destroyed, and coordinated retaliation against victims who persisted in seeking justice. His arrest sent shockwaves through military leadership circles that had assumed such high-level protection would never face federal scrutiny. Colonel Patricia Vance received updates on the arrests while coordinating the expanded investigation from Installation 847. "Sir," she reported to General Harrison, "we have Morrison, his chief of staff, and 4 additional general officers in federal custody. The conspiracy reaches higher and wider than our initial assessment suggested." Harrison reviewed the arrest reports with grim satisfaction. Each arrest represented justice for victims who had been silenced, transferred, or discharged rather than receiving protection from their chain of command. The federal response was demonstrating that systematic abuse would trigger consequences reaching the highest levels of military leadership. At Installation 847, personnel were processing the news that their local nightmare had triggered a nationwide reckoning. The soldiers who had suffered under Hutchins' reign of terror were beginning to understand that their experiences were part of a larger pattern of institutional failure that had protected predators throughout the military system. Staff Sergeant Martinez was interviewed again by federal investigators who were documenting the full scope of victim impact across multiple installations. "They moved him around like a chess piece," Martinez explained. "Every time complaints started mounting, he'd get transferred to a new base with clean records and fresh victims. The system was designed to protect him, not us." The interview revealed how the conspiracy had operated through administrative manipulation, personnel transfers, and record management that obscured patterns of abuse while enabling continued victimization. Each transfer represented a command failure and dozens of new potential victims. Agent Rodriguez was analyzing financial records when he discovered evidence of additional crimes that expanded the investigation beyond military justice. The conspiracy had involved fraudulent budget allocations, misuse of government resources, and systematic falsification of official records that constituted federal crimes independent of the abuse cover-ups. The evidence showed that Morrison's network had spent millions of dollars in government resources to manage their protection system, including fraudulent travel orders, fake training assignments, and manipulated personnel records. What began as institutional negligence had evolved into organized criminal enterprise involving multiple federal agencies. In congressional offices throughout Washington, Staffers were preparing emergency briefings for lawmakers who were learning that a federal investigation had exposed systematic corruption in military leadership. Senator Hayes was reviewing classified documents that revealed the scope of institutional failure when she realized the political implications were as significant as the criminal ones. This represents a complete breakdown of military accountability systems, she told her chief of staff. We're looking at congressional hearings, Pentagon reform initiatives, and criminal prosecutions that will take years to complete. The public is going to demand answers about how this conspiracy was allowed to operate unchecked. The senator's office began coordinating with other committee chairs to ensure that congressional oversight would address not just individual crimes, but the systemic failures that had enabled them. The case was evolving into a catalyst for comprehensive military justice reform. Lieutenant Royce was providing additional testimony about the evidence she had gathered during her embedded investigation when federal prosecutors revealed the full scope of what her courage had triggered. Her assault report had activated automatic protocols that exposed a conspiracy involving 63 officers across multiple commands and hundreds of victims spanning a decade of systematic abuse. Your decision to file that federal report has potentially saved hundreds of future victims, Prosecutor James Mitchell told her. The evidence you gathered and the federal protections triggered by your assault have given us the tools to dismantle a system that was designed to protect predators rather than soldiers. The revelation that her 3-month investigation had documented such extensive criminality demonstrated the sophisticated nature of her federal assignment. She hadn't been sent to Installation 847 to investigate routine harassment complaints. She'd been deployed to gather evidence of institutional corruption that congressional offices had suspected but couldn't prove. Back at the detention facility where Hutchins was being held, he was beginning to understand that his assault on Lieutenant Royce had triggered consequences that extended far beyond his own criminal liability. Federal prosecutors had informed him that his cooperation in documenting the conspiracy could reduce his sentence, but would require admitting to years of systematic abuse and identifying the senior officers who had protected him. Meanwhile, military installations throughout the region were conducting emergency reviews of their own personnel practices, searching for evidence of similar cover-up systems that might trigger federal intervention. The arrest had sent a clear message that institutional protection for predatory behavior would no longer be tolerated. Agent Sean was documenting victim testimonies when the full human cost of the conspiracy became clear. Over 200 soldiers had filed complaints against protected officers during the past decade, only to face transfer, discharge, or career-ending retaliation. Each case represented a failure of leadership and a betrayal of the military's obligation to protect its own personnel. The testimonies revealed sophisticated intimidation tactics, financial coercion, and systematic retaliation that had silenced victims while enabling continued abuse. Lieutenant Royce's federal protection status had finally provided the trigger for accountability that local commands had systematically suppressed. As dawn broke over Installation 847, federal investigators were preparing for weeks of additional interviews, document analysis, and evidence gathering that would support prosecutions reaching the highest levels of military command. The base that had operated under Hutchins' culture of fear was transforming into the center of the largest military justice investigation in recent history. The conspiracy that had protected predatory commanders for years was unraveling with each arrest, each interview, each piece of evidence that demonstrated how institutional indifference had enabled systematic victimization. Lieutenant Royce's courage had triggered a reckoning that would reshape military accountability for generations of future soldiers. Federal prosecutors were preparing indictments that would charge dozens of officers with crimes ranging from assault and harassment to conspiracy and federal civil rights violations, demonstrating that the military justice system would finally hold leadership accountable for protecting rather than victimizing subordinates. The Pentagon's secure briefing room filled with tension as Secretary of Defense Margaret Chun reviewed classified reports that detailed the full scope of the conspiracy Lieutenant Royce's assault had exposed. 48 hours after the initial arrests, federal investigators had uncovered evidence of systematic corruption reaching levels that threatened the fundamental credibility of military leadership. Madam Secretary, General Patricia Hayes began, her voice steady despite the gravity of her briefing. We're dealing with the largest military justice failure in modern history. The conspiracy involves 63 officers across 12 installations, with evidence of cover-ups spanning 15 years and affecting over 400 victims. Secretary Chun studied the organizational charts that mapped the conspiracy structure, each line connecting officers who had participated in protecting predatory commanders while silencing their victims. The systematic nature of the corruption suggested institutional rot that would require comprehensive reform to address. How did this network operate without detection for so long? Chen asked, though she suspected the answer would reveal additional failures throughout the military hierarchy. They exploited legitimate administrative processes, Hayes replied. Personnel transfers, training assignments, classification procedures, and disciplinary protocols were all manipulated to protect perpetrators while punishing victims. The system appeared to be functioning normally while actually enabling systematic abuse. The briefing revealed how the conspiracy had used bureaucratic complexity to obscure their activities. What appeared to be routine administrative decisions were actually coordinated efforts to manage criminal behavior, relocate problematic officers, and suppress evidence of institutional failures. At Installation 847, Lieutenant Royce was providing her final testimony to federal investigators, her detailed documentation serving as the foundation for prosecutions that would reshape military accountability. Her embedded investigation had gathered evidence that exposed not just individual crimes, but the sophisticated systems designed to protect predatory behavior. Agent Rodriguez reviewed her comprehensive reports with admiration for the dangerous work she had performed while maintaining her cover. Lieutenant, your investigation has provided the evidence necessary to dismantle a conspiracy that was destroying military morale and violating the rights of hundreds of soldiers. Your courage in maintaining that cover while documenting systematic abuse required exceptional dedication. Royce nodded quietly, knowing that her 3 months at Installation 847 had been among the most dangerous of her federal career. Hutchins' escalating behavior had threatened to expose her investigation before she could gather sufficient evidence. But his assault had ultimately provided the criminal trigger needed for comprehensive federal intervention. The federal response had exceeded even her expectations. What she had assumed would be a focused investigation of command failures had evolved into the largest military corruption case in decades, with implications reaching congressional oversight and Pentagon reform initiatives. Meanwhile, in federal detention facilities across 3 states, arrested officers were beginning to understand the scope of their legal jeopardy. Federal prosecutors had made it clear that cooperation in documenting the conspiracy could influence sentencing, but would require full admission of their roles in enabling systematic abuse. General Morrison was the first to break, providing detailed testimony about how the protection network had operated. We called it personnel management, he told federal investigators. Our job was to handle problematic situations that could embarrass the service. Nobody wanted public scandals that would damage military recruitment and congressional support. His testimony revealed the bureaucratic mindset that had enabled the conspiracy. Senior officers had convinced themselves that protecting institutional reputation justified sacrificing individual soldiers, viewing victims as acceptable casualties in maintaining military credibility. The recordings of Morrison's confession were being analyzed by federal prosecutors when they realized the conspiracy had extended beyond military justice into congressional relations and media management. The network had actively worked to suppress news coverage, influence congressional inquiries, and manipulate public information to prevent exposure of systematic failures. Agent Chun was documenting the media manipulation aspects when he discovered evidence that the conspiracy had monitored journalists, intimidated whistleblowers, and coordinated with public affairs offices to control information flow. The criminal enterprise had operated across multiple federal agencies and civilian institutions. In congressional offices, staff members were preparing for hearings that would examine how military leadership had failed so completely in their oversight responsibilities. The evidence suggested that some congressional offices had received warnings about the systematic abuse, but had failed to pursue comprehensive investigations. Senator Hayes was reviewing constituent complaints that had been dismissed or redirected when she realized that her own office had received multiple warnings about the conspiracy. Families of victims had contacted congressional representatives seeking help, only to be referred back to military channels that were actively suppressing their complaints. The revelation that congressional oversight had also failed to protect military victims added another layer of institutional accountability to the growing scandal. The case was evolving beyond military justice into a comprehensive examination of how federal systems had failed to protect service members from systematic abuse. Back at Installation 847, personnel were participating in interviews that documented the full scope of cultural damage caused by years of institutional protection for predatory behavior. The base had operated under a climate of fear that extended far beyond Hutchins' direct victims, affecting morale, retention, and mission effectiveness throughout the installation. Staff Sergeant Williams described how the conspiracy had damaged military professionalism across multiple commands. Nobody trusted the complaint system because everyone knew that reporting misconduct was career suicide. We had to choose between protecting ourselves and protecting future victims, and the system was designed to make that choice impossible. The testimonies revealed how institutional corruption had undermined the fundamental trust relationships that effective military units required. Soldiers had learned that their chain of command would protect predators rather than victims, creating a culture where abuse flourished while accountability disappeared. Federal investigators were analyzing communication intercepts when they discovered that the conspiracy had been monitoring Lieutenant Royce's investigation from early in her assignment. General Morrison's staff had suspected her true identity, but had been unable to prove it before her assault report triggered automatic federal protections. The evidence showed how close the conspiracy had come to exposing and compromising her federal investigation. Hutchins' assault had actually accelerated the timeline for federal intervention, preventing the network from taking additional steps to protect themselves or eliminate evidence. As the investigation entered its third day, federal prosecutors were preparing indictments that would charge the conspiracy participants with crimes ranging from individual assault and harassment to organized criminal enterprise under federal racketeering statutes. The scope of charges reflected the systematic nature of the corruption and the extensive harm caused to military personnel. Lieutenant Royce's courage in maintaining her cover while documenting systematic abuse had provided the foundation for prosecutions that would send dozens of officers to federal prison while triggering reforms designed to prevent future institutional failures. The conspiracy that had protected predatory commanders for over a decade was collapsing under the weight of federal investigation, congressional oversight, and media scrutiny that would force comprehensive accountability throughout military leadership. The truth that Lieutenant Royce's assault had revealed was reshaping how the military, Congress, and the American public understood the obligations of command responsibility and the consequences of institutional failure to protect service members from systematic abuse. The Hart Senate Office Building's Committee Room 216 had never hosted a hearing with such explosive implications for military leadership. Senator Patricia Hayes gavelled the Emergency Armed Services Committee session to order as television cameras captured what would become a defining moment in congressional oversight of military accountability. The witness table held 3 empty chairs reserved for senior officers who were currently in federal detention, their absence serving as stark testimony to the scope of corruption that Lieutenant Royce's assault report had exposed. In their place sat Acting Secretary of Defense Margaret Shunn, FBI Director James Patterson, and Lieutenant Colonel Kenna Royce, whose bruised face had become the symbol of institutional failure to protect military personnel. Senator Hayes began with words that would reshape military oversight for generations. This committee has learned that a single assault report filed by Lieutenant Colonel Royce has exposed the largest military justice conspiracy in modern American history. We are here today to understand how our military leadership failed so completely in their most fundamental obligation, protecting the soldiers under their command. The revelation of Lieutenant Royce's true rank sent shockwaves through the hearing room. She wasn't just a logistics officer who had been randomly victimized. She was a decorated field officer and federal inspector whose assault had triggered automatic protocols reaching the highest levels of government. Director Patterson provided the FBI's assessment of the conspiracy's scope. Senator, our investigation has documented systematic criminal activity involving 63 military officers across 15 installations. The conspiracy operated for over a decade, affecting more than 400 victims whose complaints were suppressed through coordinated intimidation and retaliation. The numbers hit the committee like physical blows. 400 victims. A decade of systematic abuse. 63 officers participating in criminal conspiracy. The scope exceeded anything congressional oversight had previously encountered in military affairs. Senator Robert Chun leaned forward, his voice tight with controlled anger. Director Patterson, how did a conspiracy of this magnitude operate without detection by military leadership, congressional oversight, or inspector general investigations? The conspiracy exploited legitimate administrative processes to conceal criminal activity, Patterson replied. Personnel transfers, classification procedures, and disciplinary protocols were systematically manipulated to protect perpetrators while silencing victims. They created a parallel system within military bureaucracy that appeared normal while enabling systematic abuse. Acting Secretary Chun provided her department's preliminary assessment of institutional failures. Senators, we have identified fundamental breakdowns in command responsibility, oversight procedures, and accountability mechanisms that allowed this conspiracy to flourish. The reforms required will be comprehensive and permanent. Lieutenant Colonel Royce was sworn in to provide her testimony, her federal inspector credentials finally public after months of operating under deep cover at Installation 847. Her detailed documentation had provided the foundation for federal prosecutions that would reshape military justice. Senator Hayes addressed her directly. Lieutenant Colonel Royce, your courage in maintaining your cover while documenting systematic abuse has potentially saved hundreds of future victims. Can you describe the climate of fear that enabled this conspiracy to operate? Royce's testimony was measured and professional, but her words carried the weight of institutional betrayal. Senators, the conspiracy created a culture where reporting misconduct guaranteed career destruction. Victims learned that their command would protect predators rather than soldiers, leaving them with impossible choices between personal safety and professional survival. Her description of the sophisticated retaliation system revealed how the conspiracy had weaponized military bureaucracy against victims. Transfer orders, performance evaluations, promotion recommendations, and duty assignments had all been manipulated to punish whistleblowing while rewarding silence. Senator Maria Rodriguez pressed for specifics about congressional oversight failures. Lieutenant Colonel, our offices received multiple constituent complaints about military justice issues that we referred back to military channels. Were those complaints reaching conspirators who were actively suppressing them? Yes, Senator, Royce replied grimly. The conspiracy monitored congressional inquiries and coordinated responses to ensure that investigations were redirected to commands that were actively participating in cover-ups. Families seeking help from Congress were unknowingly referred back to the same officers who were protecting their abusers. The revelation that congressional oversight had been systematically compromised added another layer of institutional failure to the growing scandal. Lawmakers who had assumed they were providing effective oversight had actually been manipulated by the same conspiracy they should have been investigating. Director Patterson provided additional details about the conspiracy's reach. The criminal enterprise extended beyond military justice into media manipulation, congressional relations, and federal agency coordination. We have evidence of systematic efforts to suppress news coverage, intimidate journalists, and manipulate public information to prevent exposure. The hearing room erupted in shocked murmurs as senators absorbed the implications. The conspiracy hadn't just abused military personnel. It had actively worked to undermine democratic oversight and public accountability. Senator Hayes called for order before addressing the fundamental question of accountability. Acting Secretary Chun, what specific reforms will prevent similar conspiracies from operating in the future? Chin outlined comprehensive changes that would reshape military accountability. We are implementing independent oversight systems, mandatory reporting protocols, victim protection programs, and congressional notification requirements that will prevent command-level suppression of criminal investigations. No officer will have the authority to bury complaints or retaliate against victims. Lieutenant Colonel Royce provided her assessment of what systemic reform would require. Senators, the conspiracy succeeded because individual officers controlled information flow and disciplinary outcomes. Future accountability requires independent systems that bypass command influence and provide direct federal oversight of serious misconduct allegations. Her recommendations formed the foundation for legislation that would fundamentally alter military justice procedures, creating parallel accountability systems that senior officers couldn't manipulate or suppress. As the hearing continued, senators learned that Installation 847 had been completely shut down pending comprehensive investigation of every aspect of its operations. The base that had operated under Hutchins' reign of terror was being transformed into a model for reformed military accountability. Senator Chin asked about the broader implications for military culture. How do we restore trust in command structures that have been systematically corrupted by officers who prioritized institutional reputation over soldier welfare? The question captured the fundamental challenge facing military leadership as they attempted to rebuild credibility that had been destroyed by years of institutional protection for predatory behavior. The reforms emerging from Lieutenant Royce's courage would require not just procedural changes, but cultural transformation throughout military command structures. Director Patterson concluded his testimony with words that would define the federal response. This investigation demonstrates that systematic abuse will trigger consequences reaching the highest levels of government. The military leadership that enabled this conspiracy will face criminal prosecution, and the institutional failures that allowed it will be addressed through comprehensive reform. The hearing that had begun with Lieutenant Royce's assault report was reshaping military accountability, congressional oversight, and public understanding of command responsibility. Her courage in filing that federal report had triggered a reckoning that would protect future generations of military personnel from systematic institutional abuse. 6 months after Lieutenant Colonel Royce's assault report triggered the largest military corruption investigation in modern history, the federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia became the center of a reckoning that would reshape military accountability forever. Judge Margaret Harrison presided over the trial that had captured national attention as the definitive test of whether systematic abuse would face meaningful consequences. Major Blake Hutchins sat at the defendant's table in civilian clothes, his military career stripped away along with his rank, pension, and dignity. The man who had terrorized subordinates through intimidation and violence now faced federal prosecutors armed with evidence that would send him to prison for decades. Federal prosecutor Sarah Mitchell began her closing argument with words that would define the case. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this trial is about more than one man's crimes. It is about a conspiracy that sacrificed the safety and dignity of American soldiers to protect institutional reputation. The defendant's assault on Lieutenant Colonel Royce was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of years of systematic abuse enabled by criminal conspiracy. The prosecution had methodically documented Hutchins' pattern of abuse across multiple installations, revealing how his transfers had been coordinated to prevent accountability while providing fresh victims. Each move had been orchestrated by senior officers who viewed his misconduct as a manageable administrative problem rather than serious criminal behavior. Defense attorney Robert Chun attempted to portray Hutchins as a scapegoat for systemic failures beyond his control. My client served his country for 12 years in a system that rewarded aggressive leadership and discouraged weakness. The military culture that created this situation cannot be blamed solely on Major Hutchins. But the evidence was overwhelming. Video recordings, medical documentation, victim testimony, and encrypted communications revealed a deliberate pattern of criminal behavior that had escalated over years of institutional protection. The defense strategy collapsed under the weight of federal documentation that exposed not just individual crimes but organized conspiracy. Lieutenant Colonel Royce took the witness stand for her final testimony, her presence commanding the courtroom's attention as she described the sophisticated abuse system she had documented during her embedded investigation. The systematic nature of the retaliation against victims demonstrated that this was not isolated misconduct, but coordinated criminal enterprise. Her testimony revealed how the conspiracy had operated through manipulation of legitimate military processes, creating a parallel system within official bureaucracy that protected predators while silencing victims. The documentation she had gathered provided the foundation for convictions that would send dozens of officers to federal prison. Prosecutor Mitchell presented evidence of Hutchins' escalating violence toward subordinates, showing how his behavior had become increasingly dangerous as his protection network grew more sophisticated. The assault on Lieutenant Colonel Royce represented the logical progression of unchecked abuse enabled by institutional indifference. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts: assault on a federal officer, conspiracy to violate civil rights, obstruction of justice, and organized criminal activity under federal racketeering statutes. The convictions carried a potential sentence of 45 years in federal prison. Judge Harrison addressed Hutchins directly before imposing sentence. Major Hutchins, you abused the trust placed in you by the American people and the soldiers under your command. Your systematic victimization of subordinates, protected by a conspiracy reaching the highest levels of military leadership, represents a betrayal of everything the military should embody. The sentence was swift and severe: 32 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, forfeiture of all military benefits, and payment of restitution to victims whose lives have been damaged by his criminal behavior. The courtroom erupted in applause from victims and family members who had waited years for justice. But Hutchins' conviction was only the beginning. In courtrooms across the country, federal prosecutors were securing convictions against the senior officers who had enabled his behavior. General Morrison received a 28-year sentence for his role in coordinating the conspiracy, while his co-conspirators faced terms ranging from 15 to 25 years. The systematic nature of the prosecutions sent a clear message throughout military leadership. Institutional protection for predatory behavior would result in federal criminal charges reaching the highest levels of command. The culture of impunity that had enabled systematic abuse was being destroyed through comprehensive legal accountability. Lieutenant Colonel Royce was attending a congressional briefing on military justice reform when she learned of Hutchins' sentencing. The reforms emerging from her courage were fundamentally altering how the military handled misconduct allegations, creating independent oversight systems that bypassed command influence and provided direct federal protection for victims. Senator Hayes announced the completion of comprehensive military justice legislation that would implement Lieutenant Colonel Royce's recommendations. The Military Accountability and Victim Protection Act creates parallel investigative systems, mandatory federal reporting requirements, and enhanced protections for whistleblowers that will prevent command-level suppression of criminal investigations. The legislation represented the most significant military justice reform in decades, triggered by a single assault report that had exposed institutional corruption affecting hundreds of victims. Lieutenant Colonel Royce's courage had catalyzed changes that would protect future generations of military personnel from systematic abuse. Installation 847 had been completely rebuilt under new command, its culture transformed from fear and intimidation to professionalism and accountability. The base now served as a model for military installations, implementing the comprehensive reforms emerging from the federal investigation. Staff Sergeant Martinez, who had suffered under Hutchins' abuse for years, was promoted to senior leadership and tasked with implementing victim protection programs throughout his command. The soldiers who had been silenced by institutional intimidation were now leading efforts to ensure that future victims would receive support rather than retaliation. The transformation extended beyond individual installations to military culture itself. The prosecutions had demonstrated that systematic abuse would trigger consequences reaching federal courtrooms and congressional oversight, fundamentally altering the risk calculation for officers who might consider prioritizing institutional reputation over soldier welfare. Lieutenant Colonel Royce received the Congressional Medal of Honor for her courage in exposing the conspiracy that had operated within military leadership for over a decade. Her embedded investigation had required exceptional bravery, maintaining cover while documenting criminal behavior that could have resulted in her murder if discovered. The medal ceremony recognized not just her individual courage, but the systematic reform that her actions had triggered. President Anderson spoke directly to military leaders attending the ceremony. Lieutenant Colonel Royce's courage has reminded us that military leadership means protecting those under your command, not protecting those who victimize them. As the ceremony concluded, Lieutenant Colonel Royce reflected on the comprehensive changes that had emerged from her assault report. The conspiracy that had seemed untouchable 6 months earlier had been completely destroyed through federal prosecution, congressional oversight, and institutional reform. The military that had failed to protect her and hundreds of other victims was being transformed into an institution that prioritized accountability over institutional reputation, victim protection over command convenience, and justice over conspiracy. Her courage in filing that federal report had triggered a reckoning that reshaped military accountability, ensuring that future soldiers would serve in an environment where systematic abuse faced swift and severe consequences rather than institutional protection and cover-up. 2 years after Lieutenant Colonel Kenna Royce filed the assault report that triggered the largest military justice reform in American history, she stood before a graduating class of military academy cadets whose education now included mandatory courses on ethical leadership, victim protection, and the consequences of institutional failure. The young officers seated before her represented a new generation of military leaders trained under the accountability systems that had emerged from her courage. Their education emphasized protecting subordinates rather than protecting institutional reputation, creating a fundamental shift in military culture that would prevent future systematic abuse. Lieutenant Colonel Royce began her address with words that had become central to military leadership doctrine. Leadership is not about the power to command others, but the responsibility to protect them. The moment you prioritize institutional convenience over soldier welfare, you have failed in your most fundamental obligation as an officer. Her speech detailed the systematic corruption that had operated within military command for over a decade, explaining how individual failures of courage had combined to create a conspiracy that victimized hundreds of soldiers. The cadets listened with the intensity of students who understood they were learning from someone whose actions had reshaped their profession. The reforms triggered by your investigation have fundamentally altered military accountability, Academy Commandant General Patricia Hayes told Royce after the ceremony. These officers are graduating into a military where systematic abuse faces immediate federal intervention rather than institutional protection. The changes were visible throughout military installations that had implemented the comprehensive accountability systems mandated by the Military Accountability and Victim Protection Act. Independent reporting channels, federal oversight requirements, and enhanced whistleblower protections had eliminated the command-level authority that officers like Hutchins had used to silence victims. Installation 847, completely rebuilt under new leadership, had become a model for the cultural transformation occurring throughout the military. The base that once operated under fear and intimidation now emphasized professionalism, accountability, and protection for personnel reporting misconduct. Staff Sergeant Martinez, now Senior Master Sergeant Martinez, managed victim advocacy programs that provided immediate support and federal protection for soldiers reporting abuse. The programs ensured that victims received assistance rather than retaliation, fundamentally reversing the institutional response that had enabled systematic corruption. The investigation files have been sealed, but the lessons have been institutionalized, Martinez explained to visiting congressional staff members. Every soldier now understands that reporting misconduct triggers federal protection rather than career destruction. The culture that enabled systematic abuse has been permanently eliminated. The congressional delegation was conducting oversight visits to ensure that reform implementation remained comprehensive and permanent. Senator Hayes personally reviewed accountability systems at multiple installations, verifying that the changes triggered by Lieutenant Colonel Royce's courage had created lasting protection for military personnel. Lieutenant Colonel Royce's courage saved not just current victims, but potentially thousands of future soldiers who will serve in a military culture that prioritizes their protection over institutional reputation, Senator Hayes announced during her inspection tour. Federal prosecutors had completed all trials related to the conspiracy, with final convictions securing prison sentences for 63 officers who had participated in enabling systematic abuse. The comprehensive prosecutions had demonstrated that institutional corruption would face federal criminal consequences regardless of rank or connections. The case law emerging from the prosecutions had established permanent precedents for military accountability, creating legal frameworks that would prevent future command-level suppression of criminal investigations. Federal courts had ruled that systematic abuse constituted organized criminal activity subject to racketeering prosecutions and decades-long prison sentences. Lieutenant Colonel Royce received regular briefings on the global impact of the military justice reforms that had emerged from her investigation. Allied militaries were implementing similar accountability systems, recognizing that institutional credibility required genuine protection for personnel reporting misconduct rather than retaliation and cover-ups. The transformation extended beyond military institutions to congressional oversight and media coverage of military affairs. Reporters now investigated institutional response to misconduct allegations with the understanding that systematic cover-ups constituted federal crimes worthy of comprehensive investigation. At the federal prison where Major Blake Hutchins was serving his 34-year sentence, psychologists were studying the institutional failures that had enabled his escalating abuse. Their research contributed to training programs designed to identify and address toxic leadership before it reached criminal levels. The comprehensive nature of institutional accountability had eliminated the protection systems that had enabled systematic abuse. Officers throughout the military understood that misconduct would trigger immediate federal investigation rather than administrative management, fundamentally altering the risk assessment for potential abusers. Lieutenant Colonel Royce was reviewing implementation reports when she received notification that Installation 847 had achieved the highest ratings for leadership climate and soldier welfare in its history. The base that had been shut down due to systematic corruption had become a model for military professionalism and accountability. Before we conclude this story, if you enjoyed it, please drop a comment and let us know your favorite part, character, or if you've had a similar situation happen to you before. Share your thoughts about what resonated most with you, or tell us about someone you know who showed hidden strength like Lieutenant Colonel Royce. The metrics were clear evidence that comprehensive accountability systems improved rather than hindered military effectiveness. Soldiers serving in environments where they could report misconduct without fear of retaliation showed higher morale, better performance, and increased retention rates. Lieutenant Colonel Royce's final report on the investigation's impact documented systematic improvements across every aspect of military operations affected by the reforms. The institutional culture that had prioritized reputation over soldier welfare had been permanently replaced by systems that prioritize protection and accountability. As she prepared for her next assignment as Director of Military Ethics and Accountability, Lieutenant Colonel Royce reflected on the comprehensive changes that had emerged from her decision to file that federal assault report. A single act of courage had triggered institutional transformation that would protect military personnel for generations. The conspiracy that had seemed untouchable when she arrived at Installation 847 had been completely destroyed through federal prosecution, congressional oversight, and systematic reform. The officers who had believed their rank made them above the law were serving decades in federal prison, while the victims they had silenced were leading efforts to implement permanent protections. Her courage had proven that individual actions could trigger systematic change, that federal accountability systems could overcome institutional corruption, and that protecting subordinates was not just a military obligation, but a legal requirement enforced through criminal prosecution. The military that had failed to protect hundreds of victims was now an institution that prioritized accountability over convenience, victim protection over command authority, and justice over conspiracy. Lieutenant Colonel Royce's legacy would be measured not in personal recognition, but in the countless future soldiers who would serve in an environment where systematic abuse faced immediate consequences rather than institutional protection. Her assault report had become the catalyst for the most comprehensive military justice reform in American history, ensuring that the courage of one officer would protect the welfare of all who served after her.